First of all, thank you so much. I always really appreciate your talks. My question is kind of building off of the last speaker as well, this kind of idea of cheap fuel and what that means, and kind of the, this whole argument that because we just kind of have to wait for solar panels to be more profitable, or this like environmental capitalism wave to come. And this idea that the fossil fuel industry is somehow going to be on the decline, or and I haven't read Josh Patel's book, but the idea that that the end of cheap fuel is kind of upon us, or at least a crisis within the fuel industry. So I wonder if you could touch a little bit on that, and also the ways that kind of industry keeps renewables and sustainable resources, be it like organic or different like labels that we have, in check, so that they keep their profits higher. I think that's a very broad question.
Yeah, there's like 5 or 6 in there, but that's good. Regarding whether it's just that the fossil fuels are kind of going to go away because it's going to get cheaper and cheaper. They're going to get every last drop they can out of the ground because they've already invested in the infrastructure and the exploration, and because they can. And in fact, natural gas has become pretty cheap because they can frack anywhere, and because they've been promoted in doing that. And part of what happens because of that is that projects that were going to move forward for wind power get put on hold. So the prices going down is just basically undercutting renewables at this point. The prices for people, at the pump and for heat, just if I say, the price for natural gas is going down, doesn't necessarily mean that for the person, the common person at home, that it's going to be cheap to get energy, because they can find ways to charge people more than they should. But I think basically it's very clear they've already invested everything. They've already got access to those fuels, and they're gonna make good on those investments. And it's foolhardy to believe that that's just going to go away on its own. I'd also like to mention that the nuclear power industry is making a big play here. I mean, it's not like they've ever stopped, but I recently read an article that summarized all the places in which the nuclear industry has been quietly or not so quietly undercutting renewables, trying to block subsidies for renewables, other things. And the Obama the Clean Power Plan specifically handed his friends at Exelon, who funded Obama throughout his career, and other nuclear power industries a real bonus, because it says that nuclear power can indeed be used to meet clean power goals, and in fact says that states should really be trying, if there are nuclear power plants that are at risk of being retired, as in the oldest, deadliest ones, that they should really be trying to keep those online. And so we're seeing subsidies and other things going to prop up the nuclear industry as part of this whole mix. And it's kind of like the two behemoths are fighting, like nuclear and oil, and they're trying to get in on renewables. But they're going to do nuclear and oil and gas, and then maybe renewables will come in, but I think we won't be here anymore by that point. Regarding the labels, many years ago, I was kind of thinking that if we just labeled things, that would be helpful, but it became very obvious that the corporations can undercut that. And my book has many more details than I can bring to mind right now of the way labeling has become absolutely meaningless. The word natural is used on all sorts of products. As soon as you gain any traction on something, like some kind of labeling that it's like fair trade or it's organic or whatever, they come out with their competing labels. So it's totally confusing if you're in the grocery store and you're reading all these different labels to know which is the one to go with. And of course, even if something really is organic, You know, is it really organic, like sustainably grown, or are they doing the minimum that they can on an industrial farm to have some products that they're selling that way? It's all completely confused, and the bigger problem is that a lot of times organic, unfortunately, is priced higher, and so even with the labels, people can't afford to go there. But labels have not been a successful tool for helping consumers use their consumer power to move us forward. They're totally undercut.
Yes. No, right here. Okay.
Thank you. So, I am a person who's like very bad at statistics and stuff. So, therefore I wanted to ask a more technical question. So there are some scientists and or activists that claim that even if we stop, you know, the entire fossil fuel industry whatsoever right now, we have damaged the planet, the environment so much that it is impossible for us to go back and like make things better. We should adapt ourselves to the new situation. And I was just wondering what your position on that. Thank you.
I'll be totally honest. I do lie awake at some nights and worry that that is the case. It's impossible to figure out what's real because we are talking about projecting the future. There was a particular group of scientists who were talking about the imminent potential for methane bursts, and I'm going to let you add in a second. There was one of the fears was that as the Arctic ice melts, that we might suddenly have methane bursts that were so big that we would have huge leaps in temperature really fast, and it would all be over. There was a new study that showed that historically in other times when ice melted, methane didn't escape like that. So I don't actually know whether we can turn it around. Two things. We have no choice but to give it our all because we have no choice but to give it our all. And the second is, I do think we need to be talking about ways to sequester, to pull carbon from the air. Now, I'm not talking about the crazy schemes to pump chemicals into the air and do all those sorts of things, but I am talking about organic agriculture and trees and other kinds of things to pull carbon from the air. So I think that has to be part of our formula. But it's clear we have to be doing as much as we can, as fast as we can in any case. Did you have, back there, I thought she had knowledge about that question.
I wouldn't say knowledge about that question. But I did want to ask a question about this idea that many people can vote with their dollar. You know, they're going to buy these fair trade goods or organic goods, or even like voting for the lesser of two evils. You're sort of saying that, you know, building a social movement is necessary, but what does that really mean when we're talking about like who's producing these products and what do you mean by that? Can you elaborate a little bit more?
Sure. There have been various environmental groups that have pushed for labels, and the different labels, depending on what their issue is and how they've framed it, will do things like say, you know, this product was grown organically, and that it has been certified by our organization or some supposedly independent organization where they went and visited the farms and showed that they were not using the pesticides. Is this the level you're asking about? So you know, that there's something on the product that gives you information about what happened when they were growing that food or producing that product, in terms of were pesticides used, or in terms of other products was slave labor used. And the problem is that some of those labels can be sham. You know, they say it's one thing, but when you investigate it, you go back and they really do have slave labor conditions, or they really do use nasty pesticides. But more than that, there's just so many labels now, and they're all competing that it's totally confusing. And yeah, and also a lot of people don't have access to products in their neighborhoods that are supposedly, grown well or produced fairly and justly. So not even having them in the stores. And if they are in the stores, they're out of the range for the pocketbook. Does that answer what we were talking about regarding labeling? I'm feeling like maybe it didn't.
Yeah, I guess what I'm trying to say is like the relationship between class and those that produce it, and then this idea of labeling, and that's the way that we're going to play for a better world.
Right, and perhaps the worst thing about the labeling approach to our problems is it's one of those things that reinforces capitalism and this idea. Instead of saying, this is a democracy, we're all equal, we don't have people who hoard the wealth and people who go without, and we're going to all decide, should we use pesticides or not, and should we, what should labor conditions be, and we make that happen. Instead of that, it's limiting people to being good consumers, like voting with your dollars, which is the antithesis of democracy. And you see that with it's kind of like pay to play, which is kind of the opposite of what we're supposed to do. It is the opposite of what we're supposed to do in democracies.
So up front here. Oh, okay, yeah.
Hi. I've been working on the environment for about 10 years and see more and more clearly how interrelated all the issues that I care about and most of us in this room care about are. I've been reading Rebecca Solnit's work recently. She focuses on the epidemic of violence against women in this country and in the globe. Her number one concern is climate change. She puts it through the lens of the fact that women are being degraded and injured and killed on a regular basis, and we're ignoring it globally and nationally. I thought for a long time that the attitude toward women in any society would be their attitude toward nature and toward the earth. Women give life, birth gives life. I'm just wondering whether the whole idea of women, empowering women, changing the paradigm of the way we look at women has played into your thinking about moving toward socialism.
I would say that my feminism is part of why I became a socialist. The gains that we made as women over the years have been degraded by the fact that so many women live in poverty. Poverty directly flows from this crazy system where a few hoard the wealth and we're not making the decisions. So I think we're seeing a lot of civil rights things being undercut by the failure to take on economic kinds of things. Because the insurance corporations called the shots on healthcare, it set up this situation where Democrats can now supposedly be defending women's rights to birth control and other reproductive rights, because the Republicans are saying employers shouldn't be forced to pay for women's health care for those sorts of things. Whereas if we had had a socialist kind of approach and we had the power to call the shots in our society, we would have had free health care for everybody, not connected in any way to workplaces or health exchanges and and the health insurance industry, and those issues wouldn't even exist. So, those are a couple things that come quickly to mind for me as a feminist, where I see the connections. Maybe a slightly different path than the one you were talking about for yourself, but.
So there are 3 speakers up here, 1, 2, and 3.
First off, thank you so much again for the talk. Really appreciate the clarity and the systematic way you break down, the situation, particularly the impotence of the Democrats. So appreciate that. Comment and a question. I think for me, really thinking about what the solutions are going to look like to these problems, if we're really thinking about it, it calls out the centrality and the importance of the working class in figuring out solutions to this problem. Because if we're really, if we're root ourselves in an understanding of how bad things are, and then the types of actions that we're going to need to take to rectify, this situation with things like carbon sequestration, and then even if we are able to take power and gain control of society, we can't just automatically turn off, production of oil overnight to maintain global production and stuff like that. So it's going to need to be a situation where, kind of these decrepit, terrible energy sources are going to need to wean down while simultaneously deploying new rational ones. So the idea that, we as workers, and particularly working class, in the global energy industry aren't going to need to be an independent leadership of that extremely global collaborative, effort to reorganize the economy and get us on rational green fuel sources, to me is impossible. That the working class is not going to have to take leadership of that. And B, I wanted to ask, one thing that a speaker said in the Patel talk, sorry about that, is this idea that how the system is adapting itself to kind of this inevitable climate crisis it's seeing, and trying to come up with these concoctions such as carbon taxes or ways of weaving, incentivizing green behavior through the context of the market. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and the shortcomings of that, because I've never kind of researched things like carbon tax thoroughly and understand, what they're trying to do there.
You're next, and then we'll go to the back, and then everything.
I find it easier to answer in 101 if you don't mind. My ability to store 5 questions is less than it was 20 years ago. I agree with you. Working people are central. Working people have that power that we need, because working people are the ones who can shut things down, and that's our key leverage. It's also true that the working class is being used against our movement, because there is this vacuum and there isn't sharing of this vision, and there is no security, there's no economic bill of rights, so we're constantly finding ourselves, unfortunately, environmentalists are being pitted against workers, and that's insane, and we need to be aware of the fact that there's the rank and file workers, I know you know this, and then there's the leadership, which can be a heck of a lot farther behind on getting all this than the rank and file, which is who we need to be focusing on. So regarding carbon taxes and other incentive kinds of things, yeah, they're definitely spending a lot of energy taking that approach. I guess the idea is just kind of crazy to begin with, because it's, well, we're going to tax this fossil fuel industry, and you have to wonder, how big is the tax going to be? They can just raise their prices, and they already have cheap access because of the infrastructure they already have. So is it really going to impact the fossil fuel industry for there to be an extra tax on that industry? But the crazy thing is that they then tend to tie renewable programs to getting money from that tax. So, if you succeed in actually somehow reducing the fossil fuels, you're already undercutting your renewable programs, so that's kind of crazy. But the main problem I have with the whole carbon tax approach, I'd like to see a carbon tax, sure, why not? It's a diversion. And in fact, I just had a conversation with someone from LEAP USA. LEAP is the organization that Naomi Klein is part of, started in Canada, and they've got this guy now in Seattle. And I heard that they were going to launch one of these, we're going to do the bold climate action plan here. So I was talking with him, and he was saying, well, that's not happening quite yet, because everybody's going to focus on the carbon tax. Now, I'm not sure that their climate action planning process is going to be the strong, let's focus on the root of the problem thing that I want, but it is at least kind of in the right direction of pulling people together to envision things. And they're putting on hold so that people can run an initiative, spend all this money and time to run a ballot initiative. So to me, it's just a diversion. And there's all sorts of other things like that that are incentives that are not just diversions but are downright damaging. Most important of all is the concept of pollution trading, saying, well, the environment can assimilate a certain amount and we'll just divide it, and then you can own this pollution and you can sell it to someone else, and you can keep polluting, which is an environmental justice crisis for the people who live in your area, as long as you pay someone else. And my book has story after story of how it really ends up being just a complete mirage. They didn't cut down this forest, so it's okay for our power plant to spew. Well, they weren't going to cut down that forest anyway, so it didn't really gain anything. Or, these people produced this deadly chemical, greenhouse chemical, and because we paid them, they're destroying it. And so we can keep emitting. Well, it turns out that these companies that create this chemical then started to generate more of it so that they could get paid to destroy it. So it creates this whole like crazy casino thing where you're buying and trading credits for the environment. It's a diversion, but it reinforces capitalism. Crazy.
So Jason and then Joan.
Yes, thank you again for your talk. Really appreciate it. So one thing that a number of us have talked about in the past is right when the United States entered World War II, how the economy shifted within a matter of a couple months. Everything was geared towards war production. And I'm thinking, what could it mean? Let's say we make our revolution today. Tomorrow, what are the first things that we're going to get on as far as, you had mentioned carbon sequestration, but also what do you imagine, what are you envisioning that could be on the table?
Oh, wow, wouldn't that be great? Our whole food system has to be changed because we have people starving when we can grow, when we already do grow, enough food for not only current populations but future populations, and farm workers are treated terribly. And so we would need to have a whole system for planning so that we're growing real food that real people need, and that farmers are supported instead of taking on this tremendous risk. I mean, what's happening is that you have bigger and bigger agribusiness owning everything and speculators buying farmland. So we would deal with our whole food system, which means we deal with our whole chemical industry, which is enjoying a golden age because of the cheap price of natural gas, by the way. And which also means that we would have to deal with our financing. So I'm kind of making a list of different industries we would need to deal with. But I mean, for me personally, I've got various lists of things that really bug me floating around in my head. Teachers with 30 people in a class. We would treat education the way it should be treated, and we would have vastly more teachers. And we would have the attention that individual children need. People who are taking care of children because their parents or grandchildren are somehow connected with those children would have economic security. I don't know if it means they get paid directly or just in some way that people are basically paid for that work, because I think that the work that people, primarily women, are doing to take care of elderly parents and children, we would have that worked out so that you wouldn't have all this unpaid caregiver economy going on. We'd have health care. I would go to the doctor when I needed to, instead of saying, well, $6,000 more in my deductible, so I don't think I'm going to go. Those kinds of things. I just want to mention that there are people talking about the World War II mobilization. The Bernie Sanders-Merkley bill, one of those let's not say we did kind of bills, talks about how they're mobilizing. They use some of that language, but it's not the same level. And there's something called the climate mobilization that's talking about using emergency powers that were used then, but they don't use it to take over the industries. They use it to set up commissions and things, and there's stakeholder committees with the corporations talking with labor. So, was that the kind of thing you were thinking of?
More so with respect to the environment, but we can move on.
Oh, well, I mean, the whole thing about the farming, that was basically an environmental as well as justice concern. The chemical industry, it's producing more and more plastic. It's insane. We need to be replacing plastic-focused manufacturing with, first of all, making durable products and reducing unneeded consumption. So all of those things come into play.
I had a very similar response to his, but I just wanted to underline again, what we've seen in the capitalist countries is when they want to go to war, all the resources of the society, the personnel, the scientists, everybody can be mobilized. We can send 100,000 people to Iraq overnight with weapons, with tents, with socks, with food. When it comes to Puerto Rico and the hurricane, it's not possible to do it. And I think one of the most important things that's always stuck with me, there's a very good movie called The Day After Trinity. I don't know if you've seen it, Carol, but it's about the Los Alamos Project and taking the best scientists in the world and sending them to New Mexico to develop a bomb to murder millions of people. And I think when we're feeling discouraged and it seems so overwhelming and how could we possibly fix it? Nonsense. The scientists exist. The technicians exist, the working class exists. We have all the resources we need. And I've been an optimist, it's why I've stayed active my whole life. I think it's absolutely possible if we take power, we collectively, to use all of those resources for once in the service of humanity and not the corporations. And if we're able to do that, I think we can combat climate change. I'm not as pessimistic that the world's coming to an end, just the opposite.
All right. To Mark at the lit table. Yeah, I got you.
Unfortunately, my comment is similar, which is, but the idea that whether we've reached this point of no return and it's not worth it kind of thing, I think we have more to say than we just have to try. And the reason I want to say that is because I think even when you look at the research of the projections that you mentioned, right? The research that for a climate scientist, for a chemist, for a biologist, for a mechanical engineer, the vast majority of the sort of intellectual academic institutions, their function is to reproduce and maintain this society as it is. That's why these institutions exist. And so for research to be funded, its primary goal is to research in a way that you can be useful to the production of capital and generation of profit in some way whatsoever. And what we see in that, in a way, is at first, with the Industrial Revolution, this was a massive scientific revolution. And what I think, in fact, is that when we unleash the potential of humanity that already exists, as the last comment said, we also, in a way, unleash the potential for a new level of intellectual investigation into our world. That is, the questions of carbon sequestration cannot be something that has to beg for funding because it may not be profitable. It doesn't have to be something that has to be locked up into a patent so that it's somewhere else on the planet. Somebody wants to follow that research, they have to find some wasted hours of research to get around the patent. It can be a collaborative international investigation, and the kinds of ideas, I think, that we can use already exist, but also the ones that we don't use, that we can't use because they haven't been able to be uncovered, are there. So I think, in addition, we have to try, but in fact, our only capacity to really deal with this problem is by way of unleashing the potential of humanity to actually confront it.
Nice.
Can I just say thank you, Joan, and Mark, sorry. Thank you, Joan and Mark. I do feel like I came off as more pessimistic than I should have before, because I think you're absolutely right. And I'd just like to point out that, for instance, the Stanford researcher Mark Jacobson and others for ages now have had maps you can hover over to show the existing renewable technologies. And what's happening, interestingly, is these articles are popping up in scientific journals that are questioning that. And whenever something hopeful and, you know, that would push against capitalism comes up, you do tend to see things that try to push people's hopes back down. So we should be extremely skeptical about those things that are saying there isn't hope.
So over on the left, right here, Mike, and then I'll take your questions, I believe, right in front also as well.
Okay. So, is this thing? Yes. Okay. So I have some thoughts that I can put together in coherent order here. So the thing that really struck me about your talk, especially in the beginning, is how much we are in conflict over the question of how to even make change, and part of the biggest tool for reinforcing capitalism is the recruitment of people who want to change the problems to organizations like NGOs, where the horizons are limited. You know, there are some things you can do, there are some things you can do to push. And I think we do need to be, as you were saying, making a case for socialism. You know, really challenging this idea that those are the horizons. And I think that's something that we really have to keep in mind, because it's a danger that, you know, we live in the United States. It's a very politically backward country. This is one of the only countries in the world where we've never had a political party that's emerged from the working class. In most of Europe, one of the two parties, very much a capitalist party today, but it emerged from the working class movement. What you'll see there is that as those organizations limit their horizons to capitalism, they use the language of socialist transformation to limit the possibilities. It was the same Labor Party that we've seen with, you know, Tony Blair and the war in Iraq and stuff. It had a clause in its constitution calling for the collective ownership of the means of production and the abolition of the wage system well up into the 1980s. You know, we've never produced an organization in this country on that scale that would have something like that. But this is the same Labor Party that after World War II nationalized coal. Yay, nationalization, right? No, they put it under the control of the same coal barons who used to own the coal, and that's what they staffed the nationalized, newly socially owned coal industry, right? You know, socialism? No. So I think as we really start to question capitalism, we are going to see even more radical versions of the same sort of people who are trying to limit the horizons of what's possible. And it's not just a matter of drawing up a plan or making this or that demand. The real answer is building organizations in the working class that can aid in the collective consciousness of the working class, so that each step we can puncture that the argument that it's really, you know, it's the thing I'm struck by is, you know, you were talking about demands that lead us in a transition, and maybe this is too esoteric, but if you stick around for this evening, we've got Susie Weissman talking about the Russian Revolution and Trotsky. You know, Trotsky, about 88 years ago, wrote something called the Transitional Program, which was common sense demands that, when taken collectively, would lead the working class to the realization that it needs to take power for itself. We can't just take up those demands because they were written to deal with the crisis. How would the working class respond to the rise of fascism and the oncoming of World War II? In our situation, we need to deal with the climate apocalypse that capitalism is confronting us with, but in the same way, with a range of proposals, all of which lead to the conclusion that people need to take power for themselves and not just be satisfied that they've got the capitalists to pay lip service to this or that piece of our of what we want, because I think they will. You know, we are so not used to having capitalist politicians speak the language of socialism in this country. But if we really get rolling, I think that's a danger that we could confront the same way. Right after Black Lives Matter, Ford Foundation opens its coffers, and all of a sudden that money is flowing in. You call them, set up a franchise on Black Lives Matter. Here's a check. They're setting things up to control it, and those checks and those organizations come with a hidden leash. So anyway, stop.
That hidden leash.
In the front row over here to my right, which.
I don't like the microphone.
There was somebody else in the back.
Go ahead.
Yeah, but they came after.
Go ahead.
I don't like the microphone. Just want to remind you that the Manhattan Project was a conspiracy to murder millions of people. No one knew about it. And said you knew about it. They said you're crazy. It's a very expected conspiracy. I'm extremely pessimistic. I don't see why people aren't pessimistic. I think the only people who aren't pessimistic don't study the science. It's much worse than all the models have predicted. Greenland is melting. If all the coasts are going to be destroyed, I don't see what's going to stop it. And we have to prepare for an extremely bad situation that's coming our way. And everybody I know is still flying around in jet planes. If socialism kicks in, if there's a revolution, we're going to end the military, which is going to solve a huge percentage of the problem, first thing. And second thing, are we going to keep flying? Or is everybody going to get to fly, or is nobody going to get to fly? Is everybody going to get to drive, or is nobody going to get to drive? It's going to be nobody, because it's going to be bad. It's going to be bad. And I hope you all study Beckwith, or you read Guy McPherson, or EcoShock.org, and learn about this stuff. It's way worse than you think. We have to get very serious. We need to have a jet plane boycott. We need to have a car driving boycott. We need to encourage people to understand that we really think it's a serious problem. And people don't believe it. I talk to the regulators all week in Free Speech Week. They don't think we think it's global warming because we also fly. By the way, critical mass, and all people critical mass, completely strong.
Okay, so right there, yes.
Okay, thank you very much for coming in and speaking. I agree, really outlined very clearly your thoughts. Those make a lot of sense for what you said. Two of your comments particularly, I really spoke to me and lead me to a quick question. So I like that you said that all the social justice movements are really all interconnected, and that what needs to happen is a very clear plan for when capitalism goes away. How is a clear plan for how socialism is going to change things? So my question is, are you currently working with any other groups, people, individuals, actually coming up with a plan, because you have some really incredibly good ideas?
Searching for the right people. There's a 350 Beyond Capitalism group that was formed by people who read my book in Seattle. I'm not sure it's going to morph into the place to have this conversation. Contacted the LEAP people, trying to figure out a Seattle-based socialism forum to be having these conversations in, investigating the existing groups, looking at whether there's going to be some other groups up there soon. Where'd he go?
Gerald.
There he is.
Yeah, I appreciated your presentation. In fact, it was interesting. I've never seen white environmentalists actually talk against capitalism in public. That's how bad they are. Okay?
Yeah.
That's just the way it is, you know. But I think, unfortunately, we have to do a little better, you know. And when people start talking about program, that's kind of woke me up. Because I tell you, working people aren't stupid. You know, you have the environment. Leave it in the ground. And then the limousine liberal gets in there, Mercedes, and drives on. You know, I mean, you know, I focused talk to me about it. They say about these people, leave it in the ground. Yeah, right. I mean, that's not even, it doesn't even rise to a utopian program. It's just an empty slogan. Here, a Marxist programmatic approach, what Mike was talking about, I tend to agree with him. It is necessary to develop a transitional program that explains to people, here's where we're at. We're not going to leave it in the ground, you know, but we're going to be less and less dependent on it by every step we take, and we're going to phase out of it. Well, at least that makes sense, you know, but not to just, you know, throw terms around and contradict the terms by everything that you do. It's not particularly useful. But I thought somebody was passing with us. So what's up with that? Anyway, what I'm kind of interested in, though, because you mentioned something. You said, oh, that's me doing it?
Just try
It's your nose.
Okay. You said that there was only 1% of the house in America have solar panels. That's a very interesting fact. I was shocked to hear that, by the way. I think that's a little low. Because Germany says they're dealing with 25% renewables. Is that true, first of all? So we got to get back to, you know, facts, reality, science, and stay away from the empty sloganeering. Because people sense, people are worried about this. I just spent the afternoon with my family from Northern California who had to evacuate their homes during this fire. People are concerned, but what do we have to say of any damn value to these people that is convincing, that makes sense, that points the way forward? So here, some people are debating, for instance, under a working class regime, would a nuclear reactor be handled different? Could it be, I don't know, what's the word? Well, see, my problem with it is that I don't know, what are you going to do with the waste? So I can't understand how that can fit in. But I know, at least I know I don't know. So that's good. You know, start off humble, get information, learn more. But they do have a number of these reactors in France. And as far as I know, here again, I don't know for sure, they've never had a major accident. So I'm wondering, I know in the United States, we put them on earthquake vault, you know, like crazy shit. You know? That's madness, but that happens, and we've seen it happen. We've seen the situation in Russia. But is it a fact, if we could figure out a chemical way to deal with the waste, that we cannot safely have nuclear? Is this just a bean sprout totalitarian thing? You know, no nukes, without really examining the science. That's what I'm particularly interested in. Is it conceivable that something like that could be? Here's the second question. Is it, if we put a solar panel on every house, a reactionary said this to me, if we put a solar panel on every house in America, it would not be enough electricity to run the society. That's what they claim. Is that true?
Okay, just a second. All right. Trying to remember the different questions. You were wondering about the statistic about the solar less than 1%?
Yes.
That was from, what's it called? That was from, what's it called? The International, it's a U.S. agency on energy statistics, and I checked the most recent, and it was, I think it was the statistic for electricity generation. It's less than 1%. And you know, it's a very reliable source, I think, because they're vested in trying to make it sound as high as possible. Just, you mentioned Germany and the renewables. I was just looking up German situation. I think it's kind of the dynamic I was describing in my presentation. A lot of celebration about advances on renewables, but in fact the greenhouse gas emissions are still very high. They're not really going down the way they should, and they're set to miss their goals for meeting the greenhouse gas emission reductions. There's a lot of power of the coal industry and the automobile industry over there, and the government is just coddling those industries. And even when VW was shown to have lied about, they set it up so that the emissions wouldn't be accurately measured, the government didn't do anything, just kind of turned a blind eye. So that's the statistics kind of questions. Regarding nuclear power, when I have looked into it and looked at independent scientists' analyses and Physicians for Social Responsibility and other environmental groups that are really science-based groups, Union of Concerned Scientists, I have been convinced that this industry is just inherently too risky, that we are not being told about the ongoing releases that happen at facilities. It isn't, yeah, and studies that show, you know, radiation in low levels getting in environment and people, at the ones that are operating properly. So that's a concern that gets not talked about in our society, but it's real, and there's always this risk of a meltdown, which gets worse when, you know, there's shoddy, dangerous handling of these facilities. But I have not read anything really reasonable about making the waste safe. I've read studies about how to make signage that will be readable by people in 100,000 years who don't speak English or the other languages we have today, so they will know not to go where the stuff is stored. I don't think anybody's coming up with something that really makes that waste safe. And of course, that waste tends to make its way towards indigenous people's sacred lands and places like that. So I don't think nuclear is the answer. I think it's a money-making, centralized corporate scheme for making, you know, the next, and there's always the increased risk of terrorism focused on those and materials for making bombs. What are we doing of value? Yeah, you know, we run into people really being skeptical of what we're saying. I think that part of what we need to do is people are in general, like 85–90% of the population really feel like corporations are calling the shots, and that's not right. That's like a steady thing for decades, and I think that's common ground with people to start from there. And I think we need to have at the ready the data about how much money is out there and how much is being pocketed by the few people at the top, and how each household in the United States should be earning, I forget what it was. If it was all equitably divided, it was like $225,000, you know, per person or something. So there's ways you can have at the ready the information about how we do have the resources, and the existing renewables make nuclear and fossil fuels not necessary. So you can go to I can give you a link later to a website where you can hover over every state in the United States, every country in the world, and see an example of a mix of technologies that don't involve nuclear or fossil fuel, and getting familiar with that and sharing that with people. But we need to be listening to the concerns of folks who are justifiably afraid that they're going to get screwed, and have real plans and made with them about how there's going to be real jobs as we ratchet down.
So unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time, and I want to give a tremendous thank you to Carol for being